Welcome back to Palanghi 21. Today I will show you a 2023 Italian romantic drama film titled Nuovo Olimpo. On November 1, 1978, Pietro and Ennio crossed paths for the first time. Ennio was working on a film set, and Pietro was part of a curious crowd. Their eyes met, but they did not interact or say anything. Pietro was pleasantly surprised to find Ennio at the vintage film theater Nuovo Olimpo. While the guy at the ticket counter made a move on Pietro, his eyes were fixed on Ennio. They first interacted in the backdoor hallway, which was the secret meeting ground for gay men. They sneaked into the men's room, but Pietro made it clear that he was not looking for a quick hookup. He wanted to know Ennio, and they agreed to meet a second time. After interacting for the first time, both Ennio and Pietro could not take their minds off each other. Ennio was not afraid of exploring his sexuality, and it was not the first time that he walked into the hallway with someone, but Pietro was special. There was an immediate connection between the two, even though they were not alike. Ennio told Alice about his meeting with Pietro. She is Ennio's best friend who is also his lover. Alice said that Ennio thought too much about Pietro and he couldn't get his mind off him. The next day, they were both thrilled to see each other the second time, and Ennio proposed that they meet at Alice's grandmother's locked-up house. Pietro was hesitant at first, but when he read the message Ennio wrote on the map, "So time and place won't get in the way," Pietro was convinced that the feeling was mutual. It was the first time Pietro was getting to know a man this close, and he was afraid of facing his truth. But with Ennio, he felt confident, and that was why they met again at the promised location. Ennio showed Pietro the place, and he said that they could start the relationship slowly, but suddenly Pietro kissed him. Then they made love for the first time. After that, they talked about their first encounter and their lives. Ennio was a film student hoping to make it big in the film industry, and he lived with his father. Meanwhile, Pietro was a medical student who arrived in Rome to look after his mother during her surgery. They continued the night with dinner, dancing, then feeding each other jam with their fingers. Before parting, they promised to meet again at Nuovo Olimpo. But Alice tried to convince him to join them in the student protest, but Ennio could not skip meeting Pietro again. While Alice and Ennio argued, Titti suggested Ennio take Pietro along to the protest. Ennio was glad to know that Pietro had already arrived and was waiting for him. He had to reject Alice's suggestion, and he entered the movie hall to meet Pietro once again. Pietro had booked a table for them at a restaurant, and he hoped they could spend some time together like an ordinary couple. But before their date, Pietro had to visit his mother at the hospital, and the only reason he came to the movie hall was to discuss his plan in person with Ennio. He left Nuovo Olimpo early, and in the meantime, the clash between the student protesters and the police began, the horde of protesters running from the police and flooding into the theater. Ennio got stuck inside Nuovo Olimpo. Amidst the ensuing chaos, Titti helped Ennio get out to go help Pietro, but he could not spot him in the crowd. Meanwhile, Pietro was also making his way to the theater, but met an accident on the way, getting run over by a car and getting his hand fractured, among other injuries. On the other hand, Ennio could not advance through the chaos either and went back inside. After that, they didn't see each other and Ennio thought Pietro left him. That was the last time Ennio and Pietro met. 10 years after they met, Ennio made a film about their brief yet intense romance. Due to its explicit nature, the film was barred from screening, and that resulted in massive protests. By the time the film was released, it had become an instant success. Pietro was in the audience, and he did not expect the film to be about him and Ennio. Pietro was now a doctor, and he was married to Giulia. Pietro never shared his past with her. The film left him unsettled, and Giulia could sense something was wrong. Pietro distracted her, but that did not stop Giulia from understanding that there was a secret that Pietro was hiding from her. Even though they were together, there was no romance between them. Ennio told Alice about the man he was dating. He only wanted to be with him because he was a famous director. Meanwhile, Alice told him that she was pregnant, but she wasn't sure whether she wanted to keep it or not. They comforted each other. Pietro tried to make contact with Ennio, and he revisited the old movie hall, which was converted into an adult theater. The staff had changed, and so had the people who visited the establishment. Pietro walked into the hallway and came across Ennio's old friend Molotov. But he said that Ennio no longer visited this place. Pietro gave up on contacting Ennio. Meanwhile, Alice introduced Ennio to Antonio, and even though the spark was not instant, Ennio gradually took an interest in Antonio. The two were married in 1993, but a fraction of Ennio was still hopeful about stumbling into Pietro. One day, Ennio saw Pietro sitting on the next train with his wife, but was later convinced he only thought he saw him. Pietro couldn't stop thinking about Ennio, and still kept the map from Ennio. He saw an interview on TV about Ennio talking about his latest film. Ennio said that every film he made always had a part of him. Molotov visited Ennio, and told him that he had seen Pietro looking for him years ago. Antonio supported Ennio in all of his whims and sadness. He was a rock-solid partner and a production manager. Even though there were days when Antonio could not comprehend Ennio's emotions entirely, he tried to compensate simply with his presence. One day, Ennio met Titi by chance, and he was pleasantly surprised to see her at the supermarket. He regretted not staying in contact with her, but Titi held no bitter feelings. She knew that Ennio had only love for her, and she celebrated his every win from afar. Upon meeting Titi, Ennio learned that after the protest, Pietro had returned to the movie theater in the hopes of meeting Ennio. He wrote a letter for him and handed it to Titi, but Ennio never returned to Nuovo Olimpo. The phone number attached to the letter was no longer valid, and Ennio regretted his past decisions. The letter said how Pietro regretted what happened. If only they had left the movies together that day, if they had gone to the restaurant, or if they had talked and laughed all night over a glass of red wine, like an ordinary couple, maybe they would still be together. When he was about to go see Ennio, things were already pretty bad. He got held up by the police, the protesters, and the tear gas. He also got run over by a car, and broke his arm. After that, he tried to go to Nuovo Olimpo, but he did not meet him. He still waited and missed him so much. Later, Antonio asked about the groceries, but Ennio could only cry, but didn't explain why. Pietro and Giulia watched a classic film together, and Pietro told her that he and a friend had watched that film together. At the same time, Ennio and Antonio also watched the film. Ennio's eyes filled with tears as he remembered how he and Pietro had watched that film. Giulia tried to force Pietro to talk about what he was feeling, because she felt like Pietro's mind was always elsewhere, but Pietro avoided the conversation. Pietro lied to Giulia that he was going to the hospital, when in fact he went to see Ennio's interview about his latest film. Pietro secretly watched Ennio talk about his loving husband. Ennio had always been open about his sexuality, and his films were mostly centered around his experiences. Maybe deep down, Pietro was a little envious of how bravely Ennio was living his truth while he was still hiding away. His situation affected his and Giulia's marriage, with her wanting to raise a family and him being mostly absent. Ennio told Alice that sometimes he thought about Pietro, and that he felt he had seen him on the train. Alice said that it was probably just his imagination. Antonio came and brought cake for them. Years passed, and it was 2015. Ennio was still directing films, and Antonio helped him. Ennio wanted to simulate an explosion, and a plunder was used to create the impact. As Ennio instructed for the plunder to be raised a little further, the string came loose, and the glass powder got into his eyes. In the end, Ennio was admitted to the same hospital where Pietro worked. Pietro decided to conduct the surgery when he learned that the patient was his ex-lover. The surgery was a success, and even though it was not the reunion he perhaps imagined, he was glad that he could help Ennio. Pietro was taken aback when he interacted with Ennio's worried husband. He realized that Antonio truly cared about Ennio's well-being, and it would be better if he stayed away from him. Ennio invited Pietro to his place. Pietro realized that Ennio's house was the place where he had been invited by Ennio. Ennio revealed that this place holds many happy memories. He also said that the doctor's name was just like someone he knew, someone who meant a lot to him. Through their limited conversations, Ennio figured out that he knew the doctor from somewhere. Pietro never admitted the truth, and by the time Ennio completely recovered, he refused to meet him in person. Giulia insisted on inviting Ennio to dinner, because she was a big fan. Ennio and Pietro finally met after 37 years. They did not talk much, but exchanged glances during dinner. Ennio talked about his first film, where the film was about his personal experience. He said that he now knew the reason they couldn't meet. Giulia realized that Ennio was talking about him and Pietro. Later, Giulia asked Pietro to chase his love instead of giving in to more pretense. Pietro was hesitant at first, but he finally gave in to his desire to rekindle the love that he and Ennio once shared. He went after Ennio and caught up with him. Pietro was glad that they still remembered each other, unaware of how desperately Enya had searched for him over the years. Enya told Pietro that he now knew why he couldn't see him on the day of the protest. All Pietro wanted from Enya was for him to think about him and the love they shared whenever he could. It was in their memories that they could keep their love alive since they had both moved on in their lives. Before saying goodbye, he thought for a moment about following Enya, but they lived very different lives with the people they loved. Pietro turned and walked back towards his house, and the two lovers parted once again, this time with promises to guard each other's hearts. The ending suggests what could have been had Enya and Pietro gone to the restaurant as they had planned. It did not guarantee their future together, but it would have at least been another memory that they could have cherished for a lifetime. Nuovo Olimpo is an Italian romantic film centered around the impossible love story of Pietro and Enya. They separated, but they always thought about each other in the years and decades since their brief romance. After many years, they had their own lives. Even though they met again, they couldn't just be together. Enya couldn't suddenly leave Antonio for the old love, and Pietro couldn't leave his wife, coming out and change his life drastically. Maybe deep down, they want to do it, but it's too impractical for them to consider. It was just wishful thinking, and reality caught up with them. At the beginning of the film, it shows a beautiful romance between the two. The acting is good and the chemistry is strong, but it is cut short. Then we see them living empty lives even though they still love each other. I don't think I believed their love enough. Enya had the opportunity to maintain his love with Pietro. He could have gone to Nuovo Olimpo, but he never did. Pietro met Enya's friend, but he never asked Enya's address or phone number. I think the two of them had many opportunities to be together, but they always missed it. The story dragged on for too long, as if they wanted to make a touching story. The ending is unfulfilling, but one thing is certain: sometimes we long for the love we can't have. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notification.